Hey everybody, this is Tommy, and I'm Kimberly, and we're from Ravens Creek. And today we want to talk a little bit about our name Ravens Creek. What does it mean? Where does it come from? And how it's kind of been growing on us.
So in our last video, we talked about the Elijah people, and in that we kind of spoke in passing about how we feel a kinsmanship with Elijah and how there's a lot of things in our own lives where we feel that same kind of pattern of being by the creek, being fed by ravens, sitting and waiting, and we eventually came to the point where we started to realize not only are we at that place where we're perpetually being fed by ravens, but we were beginning to almost be the ravens for others and providing food for others to consider.
It's always interesting how God will take us through a phase and then turn around and say, now you see how this works? Use this to help others to continue to grow and to keep their faith from faltering as well. This is part of what was happening.
And it's also part of being a servant of God, just simply taking this journey and walking with Him. And that's really something that God has been wrestling with us and putting in us continuously is what does it mean to be the people of God, and how is it that we're supposed to be the servants who help to raise the heirs to becoming mature sons and daughters.
Now, we've recently done a couple of videos, if you have a chance to see them, about the prodigal son. Well, about the parable, but what we wanted to talk about in that story is the unrecognized servants. That when the prodigal son came to his senses, he said to himself, "How many of my father's servants have bread to spare? And here I am starving. I will go back to my father and I will say, 'Father, I do not deserve to be called a son anymore. Make me as one of your servants.'" And that became his deep desire, was just to become like one of the servants because they had bread to spare. Now recently we found this interesting connection all the way back around with the servants having bread to spare, and then Jesus also saying at a different time that consider the ravens, for they neither reap nor sow, they have neither storehouses nor barns, yet the Lord feeds them, and they have plenty, or perhaps it may be translated, they have bread to spare.
Yeah, so much that in the case of Elijah, they're sharing their bread with the prophet. Now, when you look at the servants in the parable of the prodigal son, they brought a jealousy to the son. Now, this is something that we really hit on hard in our video. And this is something that's characterized our lives, is that one of the things we want to do is we want to stir up a jealousy in the believers, in the Jews, in the people who aren't believers. We want to drive this jealousy that would cause for them to ask the questions of why is it they don't have storehouses and yet they've got plenty, and why is it that God provides for these ravens while we're kind of sinking and drowning and nothing seems to be happening correctly.
For us, this has been a very interesting calling that God has put upon us for this time. And this is something that we hope will create a good example for others as well. However, we don't make this the example to follow. We don't expect people to become exactly as we are or become ravens as well. However, there's two things that we really want people to consider. Although ravens are considered an unclean bird, and perhaps we're not perfectly theologically aligned with so much of mainstream or even with some opinions of those who watch, still it is something that God uses to bring the bread in the morning and the meat in the evening. We believe that God has put out a call for an Elijah people in the last days. And in that same way that the story of Elijah, God starts providing with the ravens at the creek, but he moves on and the Lord provides for him in another way, and he moves further and the Lord provides for him another way. But it is always God's hand that's providing. In the same way, when the prodigal son comes home to his father makes him as a son. He's not a servant. Yet either way, he still provided for from the Father's table, from the King's table. And both Elijah and that prodigal son have that pure food that they don't work for, they don't bring in themselves, but the Lord provides for him.
A few videos back, we had talked about eating holistic foods, and we kind of went with this idea of, for the new year, people like to go on to diets, and so we wanted to talk about going on a sort of spiritual diet, if you will. And we referenced being a generation after Josiah with Daniel and his companions and how they didn't eat the defiled meat that the king had given. And in the same way, we're challenging you here even now to consider that which is put before you, that Elijah never had to go hungry. He was never at this point where he had to go scavenging for himself. God always provided for him. And it doesn't matter what stage you're at in your walk, even in, I believe it's 1 Peter, he talks about having pure spiritual milk, almost making a distinction between that which is pure and which is not
Artificial.
pure, artificial. And so you can have this idea like, yeah, there are people who give milk, but is it pure milk? Yeah, there are people who provide meat and deep thoughts and considerations, but is it pure? The big thing to understand is that when God provides something, it really has the proper nutrition, it's holistic, and it satisfies in a way that nothing else can. And so if you were to ever go back to something that is not holistic, your body's going to be able to tell, and it's not going to want it. And so how is it that Daniel and his companions could tell the king's meat was defiled? It's because they've been sitting at the Lord's table long enough that now that they're sitting at this Babylonian king's table, it's not the same. And that's really where it comes from for Elijah, for when you move on and you get fed by the woman at Zarephath, and even later after that, getting fed by an angel with cakes. You know it's from the Lord because it satisfies just like the food from the ravens satisfied, and just like the provision before the ravens satisfied.
Something we really want people to be able to consider for themselves is their own calling. For us, the Lord was able to take us through a time and then come around and show us that parallel so that we can do for others the same kind of thing that God had just taken us through. But the Lord calls people, different parts of the body, to function in different ways. He gives them different callings and offices and equipment and talents and things that they can serve in different ways. However, the Lord never just throws you into something without explanation, without having prepared you in some way. Sometimes it takes us a little while to understand that preparation or understand something that just happened so that we know how to move forward and give that provision to others as well. This is something that we've learned from the walking out of it. And this is something you do as a servant, is you learn while you work. As you're a child, this is also something you do. As you grow up, as you mature, as time passes, you're learning as you go. We often get this idea that when we're fully equipped, when we're fully ready, when we're fully committed, when we have ourselves all collected together, then the Lord will be able to use us, or then the Lord will be able to send us, or then we will have the courage to be something that we are not yet. But God has already made us to be the person that He wants to use. It's just learning from God how to use the things that He's put in us. Again, in the story of the prodigal son, we see the servants just being servants. And this is enough to create a jealousy for the son who comes to his senses. In the story of Elijah, we see ravens being ravens. They're these kind of unclean birds who pick and scavenge from different things. The only extraordinary thing about these ravens is they happen to come straight to a prophet and bring that extra bit of food. The food that Jesus refers to in Luke 12 as not coming from barns or storehouses or reaping or sowing. The provision the ravens brought was from God. The ravens wouldn't have had it if it wasn't for God, let alone the prophet. The servants wouldn't have had bread to spare if it hadn't come from the Father, from the Master, yet they'd had enough bread for themselves and to spare. This was something that was just enough to create a jealousy within the son, and within Elijah it was enough for him to continuously trust in God without fear.
And so it is with us that we know that we're not necessarily that final ending mark for everybody, but sometimes we're just that stepping stone to go to the next place, to go deeper, to become even further into what God has made you to be. And we're okay with that.
We believe at Ravens Creek that we are a part of something that will help, hopefully, a whole generation who are willing to seek the face of the God of Jacob. Mm-hmm. We hope that we are just a part of something that's going to continue on past us. And the Lord has set us here to be this part of the journey of many people. We aren't trying to be the be-all, end-all. We're not going to teach you everything about the scriptures or everything that God intends to teach you. However, we will be here where God has put us, and we will bring you that which the Lord has provided for that day. But don't be surprised when God's taking you beyond even what we have to share.
And so for those of you who are here now, and you're in the waiting, you're at this creek, we invite you to join us and continue to come back so that we can provide you a little bit of Raven's food.